Pereira. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. And we welcome you to our graduate seminar series at Common Christian College University on behalf of English Department and particularly the chairperson, Dr. Fatma Saida, and graduate seminar organizer, Ms. Nadia Iftikhar, and the department in general. I welcome you and thank you for sparing this time. So just to give you a short introduction to the audience, and also just to inform you that the session is being recorded. Before we start, I'm going to introduce you briefly. Professor Sasanka Pereira teaches sociology at South Asian University, New Delhi, and is founding faculty member of the university's Department of Sociology. He was Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences from 2011 to 18, and at present he was also the he is a dean at the present, and he was also the vice president from 2016 to 19. His recent publications include a mixture of theoretical, analytical, and creative works, which includes Fear of the Visual Photography Anthropology and the Anxieties of Seeing, published in 2020, War Zone Tourism in Sri Lanka, Tales from Darker Places in Paradise in 2016, and Violence and the Burden of Memory, Remembrance and Erasure in Sinhala Consciousness in 2015. He has co-written Against the Nation, Thinking Like South Asians, and co-edited Intersections of Contemporary Art, Anthropology, and Art History in South Asia, Decoding Visual Worlds, and Sociology and Social Anthropology in South Asian Histories and Practices. In addition, he has also translated in Sinhala Justine Gardner's novel Vita Brevis, A Letter to St. Augustine in 2019, and Hishi Ino's play Face of Jesu in 2016. He writes both in Sinhala and English, and it's our pleasure that he has joined us today. Just to give you a brief overview of his talk, the title will be Confessions of a Reluctant Sociologist, Research Writing and Passion in Social Sciences and Humanities in Contemporary Times. So, Professor Sasanka Pereira, I welcome you to our discussion with our MPhil students, and we look forward to an engaging discussion with you at the end of the talk. I'm going to turn the video towards students now, and we look forward to your discussion. Thank you. Okay.
All right. So you actually have a class.
Yes.
I thought these young people were joining from their home. So in a sense, your university is far more progressive or brave than ours because we are still, doing this online thing, and it's truly getting on my nerves because this is not something that is easy for people to do, for both teachers and students. But anyhow, let me, this. I'm not really sure how to do this because it's not every day that I talk to people in language and linguistics or translation studies, even though I dabble in some of these things on and off. And what I got from Nukpa was, kind of an open invitation to talk about my research. And I assume this is a course that has to do with research methods and so on. And when I looked at the syllabus, I thought it's a pretty open syllabus in a sense, just as much as the invitation to the talk. So the initial difficulty I had was to fathom a kind of a structured presentation, which is what I've been doing for the last 30 years. But today I don't have that because this is not my regular kind of talk or the regular kind of audience. So what I've done is to take some notes, and I want to rattle off few things about what I think people should be thinking about when they are looking at research and writing in our part of the world. But I don't want to talk about research proposals, formulating hypotheses, and those kinds of things, which I think should be discussed in your class, unless, of course, they come up in our conversation when you and I have a chat. So, what I'm going to do specifically is to talk of my very subjective take on what I see as problems, what excites me as a person, as a scholar, how I do my work, and what is possible in times to come. And then why I called my presentation Confessions of a Reluctant Sociologist is because that is precisely what I am. I am bored to death with sociology. And this is why, and there are reasons for that. I mean, I would rather write poetry and fiction. I do write poetry, but not fiction so far. And I do translations, generally, fiction. I'm not really that keen to translate the kind of thing I write or people like me write. So this is because I think much of what I read today in my discipline, to be sure, tend to be devoid of what I consider excitement. I mean, they're colorless, pretty boring, right? And this is, of course, people get very upset when I say this, but it has no color. It has no life, by and large. I mean, it doesn't mean they are bad studies. It doesn't mean that what we find as research today in our part of the world, in my discipline, is bad. It's just that I don't find it exciting. And also, much of this tend to be utilitarian, in the sense that quite a few of the studies that we will see in social sciences in general, particularly in sociology, tend to be this problem-solving kind of thing, the very applied kind of stuff, developmental-oriented, in the sense that, this is what consultancy business has created in our part of the world, very clearly in Pakistan, very clearly in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka as well, and in Bhutan. And to some extent in India as well. So I think our kind of disciplines have been taken over by this utilitarian kind of interest, which is why, in my mind, in my subjective bias kind of mind, these works tend to be very colorless, right? And I want to talk about, this is where I think I will refer to my own work, not because, and I'm a bit embarrassed to do this because generally I don't talk about my work. I think it's other people's business to talk about it if they're interested. And this might be one of the few times I'm going to do this, because to me it's methodologically easier to do. And also this is what, Nukpa asked me to do. So, but even though I have this criticism, I think it doesn't mean that the entire field of social sciences or sociology is completely like this. But there are exceptions, and I think we have to recognize those exceptions. Now, I'm just going to mention two. One is from Pakistan, the other is from India. I don't know whether you read this, there is this very interesting 2012 book by Matthew Hull called Government of Paper, Materiality and of Bureaucracy in Urban Pakistan. And this is one of the most fascinating things I have read in recent times, and I made it a compulsory reading in my class on sociology of South Asia, because it is fascinating in the sense it looks at files, these government files that has to do it. It shows how important a simple file is in making a person's life miserable, or trying to make something happen or not happen. It's very unusual kind of study in that sense in our discipline. This is not management studies, right? The second, if you get a chance by next year, have a look at this book by a young sociologist called René Thomas. And he's just going to publish this book by about January next year from Routledge, called Science and Religion in India, Beyond Disenchantment. And I found it fascinating because he's trying to look at ideas of faith in a place where you don't expect to have religion at all. And these are the premier science institutions in India. You expect scientists to be somewhat secular and logical, rational, and so on is obviously not the case, right? So I found that contradiction quite interesting. So now I prefer to see these kinds of studies, at least a few more, while these utilitarian things might also be available if people want to do that. Now, why the question to ask is this: why is it that our disciplines are in this state? Why is it like this? Or is it just my imagination? I think there are a number of reasons. I just want to outline them very quickly and then get to discuss what might be done about this through taking my work as an example. Often publishers dictate what is sellable. It's not scholars like me or Nukpa or you who will decide what we want to do. It is often publishers. Now, people have told me to change the title of some of my books. Say this is not sellable. So, and sometimes you have to negotiate, and if you have enough power in this hierarchy, you can tell them to get lost. But it's very difficult. No, there's this book called Anthropology in the East that is basically about the history of sociology and anthropology in India. And for the life of me, I could not figure out why on earth a book on Indian anthropology and sociology could be called East. I mean, what is East? It goes all the way from India, from the Middle East right up to Japan. That is where the East is. So when I asked the editor, one of the three editors, why did you give this very strange title to an otherwise pretty good book? Then you know what she's told me? The publisher insisted that this must be called Anthropology of the East, because that is when you could sell it. So they have the power to dictate terms, right? And the unfortunate thing is often authors also agree, particularly if they are younger authors who are coming into the scene. You can't really make arguments when you actually want to get your first or second book published. And also what is important is that what is being researched, what is being written, and what is being published are not always motivated by an author's actual interests. It is often motivated by globally and regionally dominant trends in terms of methodology, theory, thematics, and also finally ways of seeing. Now, my last book was on photography. I'll come to it in a little while. Now, who on earth in sociology would want to write a book on photography? But at my age, I can decide what I want to write. I mean, that's one good thing about getting old, because one can simply say, you don't want to publish, fine. I will put the whole thing online and anybody can download it. Why would I care? Anyway, authors, whether it's you or me or somebody else, we don't make money from these things. No, the publishers do. There are also other things. It is important to figure out who reads what, and also what is not read. And also, finally, the way in which language is deployed in what we write. So often, what motivates us is not necessarily what is really based on your own interest. It's based on all these other considerations, right? So what I'm trying to say is that if you are looking at research, if you're trying to understand how writing is the way it is, I think you have to look at these considerations. Often we don't, because it is not about. It is not about an interesting research problem. It is almost always about a research that is somehow appealing to the dominant discourse. It is about research that is appealing to publishers, and so on and so forth. And these are way beyond the intellectual interests of the person, right? Generally speaking. Now the question is, I mean, you can always disagree with me and say that social sciences are not this bad, I'm exaggerating, and so on. So, but this is my position in general. I already said there are exceptions. So the question then to ask is, how can you bring color and life back to what we write and what we research? And I think much of this has to do with two things, the methodology and theory, right? And I want to talk a little bit about both of these in the next 20 minutes or so. I think lack of excitement, in my opinion, in available research and writing is mostly a matter of methodology. Mostly. Theory comes later, right? That is, there is a very obvious methodological conservatism in our social sciences. When I say our, I mean in South Asia. But I think this can also be extended beyond the region, right? And also there is a lack of innovation in terms of the kinds of things you want to research about. That is because we still see people in my discipline talking about caste. Talking about, I mean, it's not that the caste is a bad thing to talk about. It's an interesting research problem, but it is being talked as if there is nothing else to talk about, right? People talk about religion, but in the same way that religion has always been talked about, and you assume that if you want to study Buddhism in some sense, you have to go to Sri Lanka, right? Why not study Sri Lankan Islam? There's almost nothing on that because it's not the same thing you will find in your part of the world. Things have changed radically in recent times, which has completely changed the persona of Sri Lankan Islam. Now, I would like to know more about it rather than about Buddhism. And even when it comes to Buddhism, it is about people are not looking at generally, how is it that such a supposedly peaceful religion, in terms of its ethics, in terms of its doctrinal position, can so easily may justify violence against minorities, which is going on all the time, right? And the moment you show those kinds of things, now that kind of literature I would like to see, but you don't get it to the same extent as the more received wisdom kind of material that comes from on these same themes. So I'm not saying that certain themes are the problem. What I'm saying is that we don't necessarily look at things in different ways. That's what I said at the beginning. There's a problem in our ways of seeing. Right? Not literally, but in terms of our perception and how we problematize something, right? Now, in this context, because my claim for the moment is that this is about a methodological conservatism, I think we have to look at what are the new possibilities in make this conservatism a little bit more exciting. That to bring some kind of color while not compromising the integrity of the discipline. So before I go to describe what I've tried to do, two things that you will see when I describe my work a bit later, I have tried to do this by bringing into social sciences, or in my case, sociology, the kind of thing no sociologist in his right mind will touch in methodological terms, and one is photography and the other is visual art, right? Painting, sculpture, installation, and so on and so forth. And remember, most countries in this region have fairly pronounced history in these things, right? On their own. But that doesn't mean that people have looked at the methodological possibilities of these kinds of very subjective things like photography. I mean, you will ask, how do you quantify photography? How do you quantify art? So my point is, why the hell do you want to quantify any of these things? You have to look at what is it that you can bring into these disciplines to make it not just more exciting, but also to make certain a nuanced way of looking at things. And I will explain this in a little while. I think, and why not poetry? I think you dabble with these kinds of things in your classes, or fiction to some extent. Now, when I say this, I am not saying that we can look at a kind of a sociological problem simply by looking at poetry in a particular place. But I'm saying that why is it not possible that particular kind of fiction or creative writing and particular kind of art not be combined with other methodological possibilities, right? Now, and I will give you explanations as I go on in a little while. But to do so, to take these kinds of risks, in a sense, or to be innovative in this sense, we have to be actively anxious or weary of the kinds of these hegemonic positions that I referred to earlier. So you can't really, if you want to make these kinds of creative innovations, you can't be swayed by the interests of the publishers. You can't be swayed by the hegemonic discourses of thematics or theory or methodology in any particular place beyond a point, right? Now, of course, this is easier said than done, because, I used to do the same kind of thing in my forgotten youth, because you have to listen to these gatekeepers. No, in our discipline, there are gatekeepers everywhere. So you have to listen to these old people. And even now I hear this when I go to some conferences and so on and so forth. They will ask this question from particularly young colleagues: what is sociological about this? Because that person may have used something particularly creative. If that person is using photography as a method to interrogate something that people think is not possible. So I think everything is sociological. It depends on how you're looking at it, right? Now, let me give the examples of what I'm talking about by looking at some of my recent work. So it will be a bit clearer. Now, in 2015, I published something called Violence and the Burden of Memory. I have a long-term interest in memory, right? Violence and the Burden of Memory, Remembrance and Erasure in Sinhala Consciousness. So I was looking at the war in Sri Lanka, the civil war that ended in 2008 or some such thing. And how do people remember their kin who died or disappeared under exceptional circumstances? Because we had no point of reference to this kind of thing before, to the same extent, right? So I was not sure how memory works. And to do that, I looked at a number of possibilities where I thought memory must be embedded in certain ways, right? Now, one place I looked at obviously was the conversations of people. How do they, and also religion, how do people keep the memories of the people who have died or disappeared in terms of the rituals that are part and parcel of the day-to-day religious practices in that country? So that is one discourse that I looked at, but that is not unusual. People may not use the word memory in looking at ritual practices, but this is something that is known. What is unusual in terms of, at least at the time I tried this, was when I opted to look at memory as something that is active by looking at monuments, public monuments and tombstones, those kinds of things, because I could see that our cemeteries at that time completely changed. The kinds of the tombstones that were built was unheard of before. unseen before, in terms of color, in terms of the architectural elements, and so on and so forth. And these were making their presence felt. I mean, in artistic terms, someone might even say, with a bit of bias, that these were absolutely ugly things, to be very crude about it, because the sedateness that you expect in a cemetery was completely gone. These things were bright colors, and there were guns and helmets and military, what do you call those, battle tanks, replicas, soldiers in camouflage, with their heads too big, and so on and so forth. So this whole place, the cemetery and the public spaces where these things were built, changed overnight. The landscape became a landscape of memory, right? So I thought, you cannot talk about the Sri Lankan memory unless you also look at how memory is embedded in these kinds of places, these kinds of structures. It included schools and so on and so forth, which were named after soldiers and so on. The other place I looked at memory is even more unusual, and that is I looked at visual art, painting, sculpture, and installation, because in the Sri Lankan context, and also to some extent, I know this is happening in Pakistan and India as well. Artists, contemporary artists, are among the most vocal people in terms of making political statements. It's not that long ago that that installation of Adila Suleiman was dismantled in one of your galleries. I think I forget whether it's Karachi or Lahore. Now that is because there are a lot of explanations, but the point is that work of art referred to disappearances in Pakistani society. So we have the same kind of thing. So compared to the kinds of academic writings that deals with memory and disappearances and war, I thought, and I could see that things like art was far more actively engaged with those kinds of politics. But the unfortunate thing was that no one in social sciences was taking art seriously, because it was art, because it was considered subjective, because it was considered not statistically valid, right? So for me, I thought at that time, unless you look at these repositories of memory in a creative sort of way, any kind of investigation into the Sri Lankan memory of that time would not be complete, would not be accurate, would not be nuanced, right? So this is what I tried to do with in that particular book. Then in 2016, I published something called War Zone Tourism in Sri Lanka, Tales from Darker Places in Paradise. What I mean by this is that we all know what tourism is, but there was a very strange kind of tourism, that local tourism, domestic tourism, that took place in Sri Lanka just after 2008, and also in the midst of the war, when there were ceasefires, very faulty, but ceasefires. People in the south, the Sinhalese people, went in large numbers in buses and so on and so forth, looking at sites of violence, where killings have taken place, right? Where battles have been lost or won, where infrastructure of the guerrillas remained intact after the war, like bunkers and so on and so forth, where the military had dismantled the guerrilla infrastructure and built their own. So I wanted to see, by looking at where these people went, what kind of things they photographed, what kind of things they uploaded onto social media, what is the way in which they understood the land and the politics on it, right? And it was simply not adequate to talk to people in the conventional sense. Interviews were done, but that was not enough in my mind. So what I wanted to do was to follow these people, take photographs of them taking photographs. Why did certain places become far more important in a photographic sense than other places? And to what extent did these tourist trips become a, 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 a kind of knowledge base for what happened? And what I realized is that this kind of tourism, tempered by the victor's victoriousness and tempered by a kind of a very, very nasty, exclusive sense of nationalism, was not at all, it was not possible for people to see the pain of the area. There's no way that a clear analysis of the Sri Lankan civil war or its destructions could be understood. So this is what I was trying to do. Again, to me, in that study, photography was a very, very important methodological tool. It was not a matter of, it was not a secondary discourse that was simply aimed at giving some illustrations to what I was writing. I could not have written what I wrote in that book and in the previous one without photography being centrally implicated in my text. This is what I mean by being methodologically innovative. I mean, in my own sense, but people have criticisms of this, right? But in these two books, I brought in a lot of visuals to be as centrally important in my narrative as was the written text, right? It was not something that is meant to simply illustrate, right? Now, this final book that I wrote in 2020 called Fear of the Visual, Photography, Anthropology, and Anxieties of Seeing is, it confronts the problem of why is it that photography is not seriously thought of as a methodological tool in social sciences. And I go into the history of this whole thing from the colonial period and so on and so forth. I mean, it is very complicated. I don't want to go into details of this, but what I wanted to do there, it was unlike the two previous books, in which I used visuals and those kinds of things as methodological tools without really making a claim about it. They were ethnographies in the conventional sense, whereas this one was a methodological investigation of what visuality, particularly photography, can do to our social sciences. And I think if you are looking at being creative in these kinds of fields, I think it is possible as university students to do so. What becomes difficult is when you have to deal with the publishers and reviewers and so on and so forth when you're out of the university, when you have to deal with the real world, when you have to deal with the gatekeepers, right? Academic gatekeepers. Well, I don't know whether in your part of the world, even in the universities, whether these things are difficult. But in my case, because our university is very new, we are generally very open to students who are trying to be innovative, right? Okay, now these are the only three books I'm going to refer to. There are a lot of others, but it doesn't make much sense to go into all this. But I said at the beginning that I want to talk a little bit about theory, because this is the other area in which our innovativeness in what we research and what we write tend to diminish, because it's not only a methodological thing. I think it's mostly that, but theory also plays a role. And when it comes to theory and theorizing, I again think that we are not very innovative. We are not trailblazers in theory in our part of the world. We are mostly followers. It doesn't matter whether it's India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka. We are not. I mean, we don't come up with our own theoretical constructs. So, for example, writing in 2016 in an essay titled "The Work of Theory: Thinking Across Tradition," 3 Indian colleagues, Prathama Banerjee, Aditya Nigam, and Rakesh Pandey, makes the following observation, and I listen very carefully, right? They say, theory appears as a ready-made body of philosophical thought produced in the West, which either fascinates us or makes us turn away. So either you are against those Western theory or you embrace it without a question. Further, they say, the more theory inclined among us simply pick the latest theory off the shelf and apply it to our context, notwithstanding its provincial European origin. For we believe that theory is by definition universal. Now, this is completely crazy. I'm not suggesting that, to go to some kind of nativism, but for God's sake, at least you should ask the question, a body of theory that emerges in a very specific historical and political context, can it be just applied everywhere else without at least questioning the possibility, right? With reference to India, they argue further, our relationship to theory is dependent, derivative, and often deeply alienated. And I fully agree with this position. Now, one of your own scholars, Akbar Zaidi, writing in 2002, much earlier than these three Indian colleagues, in an essay titled The Dismal State of Social Sciences in Pakistan, notes the following, notes that social sciences in Pakistan are dismal state because one of the reasons he gives is that Pakistani social scientists blindly apply imported theoretical arguments and constructs to Pakistani conditions without questioning, debating, or commenting on the theory itself. Right? Now, these colleagues are talking about social sciences in two countries. But why I am fascinated by what they say is because this explains the nature of social sciences in this entire region. All you have to do is to change the reference to Pakistan and India to South Asia, it will work, unfortunately. Because this conservatism, the fact that we are not innovative, the fact that we are followers, applies everywhere. See, what these scholars are generally referring to is that their own... what I want to say is this. If we are not careful about asking ourselves, can the kind of theoretical constructs that emerge from very specific conditions be wholesale kind of applied to our conditions without making these kinds of self-reflective observations, without really engaging with it, can it lead to innovative research? Can it lead to innovative writing? So what I see mostly in these times, and I mean, all of us do this, because we want to be known as some people who are familiar with Foucault, familiar with Derrida, and before that with Marx and Hegel and so on and so forth. And we, for God's sake, we should be familiar with them. Why shouldn't we? But does it mean that that we cannot come up with our own kind of theoretical constructs to engage with these ideas, which is what, to some extent, decolonizing theory nowadays tries to do from Latin America, Africa, and to a lesser extent South Asia. Now, there is a course that myself and a colleague of mine, Ravi Kumar, teach our PhD students, which starts tomorrow. It's called Social Theory, Society, and Modes of Thinking. This used to be called Advanced Sociological Theory, which is the standard name given to that kind of course in most of our universities in this region, probably in your country too. Now, what we try to do is to put into practice this critique that I made by making sure that our students are familiar with the Western theory, but to engage with that too, rather than embracing it. And to do that, we are introducing to them a whole lot of decolonizing theory and this Southern, what is known as Southern theory to some extent. And also asking them, can we bring into this conversation about what theory is and how theory is constructed, the kind of things that are not considered theory in sociology. So we encourage our students to look at Ambedkar, for example, his writing. there was a South Indian activist and a writer called Periyar. So we are asking our students to read his material. We even ask them to read this old Charvaka school of thought, whatever is left of what we know. We are asking them to read Buddhist positions from the scriptures about the self, for example. And in that context, we are also asking now, can we engage with this material, which is regional, to come up with a set of a body of theoretical knowledge in our region? I mean, this is an incomplete exercise, but at least we started it because we thought without that kind of initiative, research in our part of the world cannot be creative. It will always sound like and feel like what it is today, right? Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the craft of writing, which is probably more your kind of thing. But I'm not talking about writing in language studies and so on. I'm talking about writing in social sciences, but with an emphasis on my kind of discipline. I think what has happened is that more than the research itself, more than considerations of methodology in the way I outlined, or more than engaging with theory in the critical sense that I tried to explain, what has happened now is that language itself has become the ultimate goal, in the sense that we sometimes write in a particular language, particular style, that is, I would consider very uncommunicative, very, what is a polite way of putting it? Abstract in a sense, to put it mildly. I think what is going on, you will see this in my bygone youth when I was reading Gayatri Spivak and Derrida and Foucault and so on. I mean, standard reading, in 1980s when I was studying in America. The life of me, it took me a long time to get through these things. And it is not because of the complexity of the ideas, but because of the obstructiveness of the language that many of them used. And I tried this experiment with some of the people in my group, whether we can write in a simpler English what Foucault and Derrida has done in 25, 30 pages, whether we can do it in 2. And oftentimes it worked. And I wish I had kept those notes, because I could have probably written a much better introduction to their ideas than they had done themselves, right? So to me, the problem is this. It distances people from engaging with ideas, right? Now, of course, the moment I have said this before, and my colleagues say that you are very anti-intellectual, this, that, and the other. So, I mean, to be even to be anti-intellectual, you have to understand what is being written, right? If it's some abstract thing, what's the point? I am not saying that theory should not be abstract. It should be. That is the bottom line. But it should communicate that abstractness in a way that we understand, right? And you will also know that one reason why there is this anti-theoretical bias in our social sciences, I'm sure it's the case in probably some schools of thought in Pakistan too, I'm not familiar, but certainly in India and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, I know that there are people who have now distancing themselves from theory, and that is also bad, because they instead go for descriptions. Now, what we want is not descriptions. What we want is a study that is rooted in the circumstances where it's supposed to investigate, and a robust theoretical engagement to explain why things happen in a particular way. Now, to do that, I think it is ideal if those theoretical constructs also come from our engagement with the places where we work. This is what I was trying to say. Plus, I think it is essential that language communicates an idea rather than put hurdles to it. I want to say something very briefly, and then I will end about translation, because this is one of the things I understood that you people engage with. Whereas you might be trained to do translations, I have not been trained to do this. I just dabble in it because it fascinates me, right? And of course, my fluency is only with two languages, English and Sinhala. But what I've been doing lately has absolutely very little to do with academic work. For right now, I am translating Rumi, which everybody knows, but from English to Sinhala, because I can't read 13th century Persian. But then I find it fascinating. And I had to ask the question, why is it fascinating? Because I mean, this is a man who has been talked about in all sorts of places, including in South Asia, because we know that by 19th century, there were a lot of discourses, formal written discourses, mostly in Urdu, where people were actually talking about his work, his poetry in South Asia, and almost none of that is translated into English. So I realized that if I am to get a handle on this, I have to go and talk to these Urdu scholars, I suppose in India to begin with, to help me read this stuff, because I can't read the language. Now, but the point is, it is for me, the reason why I'm interested in translation, I mean, mostly right now in creative stuff, is because I think they do two things. And I'm now thinking as a social science person. One is that people forget that creative writing, whether it's poetry or fiction or whatever, is also a reflection of a particular time, if it's written in such a way. So, for example, if I read Faiz Ahmad Faiz, it gives me an opening into the kinds of times that he and the pains that the man lived through. And I hardly consider him Pakistan in the sense, because the themes that he was dealing with resonates on all of us, which is why a few years ago we organized a seminar with him on his work in New Delhi in our university. And Salima Hashmi, one of his daughters, also came to talk about his work. And it went very well, because all of us were interested in poetry, not only as poetry, but poetry as a repositories of certain kinds of social science knowledge, which was our interest. But of course, we got a complaint from a student and say, why are you celebrating a Pakistani poet when there are so many Indian poets? So I told this guy, you wait, find somebody interesting enough, we'll look at his work next time. I can't do everything in one go. But it shows the kind of additional biases that have percolated into even something creative. Now, so the point I'm trying to make is that, to me, the act of translation is also a very clear political act, because now by translating Rumi from even from English to Sinhala, in a country where absolutely no discourse have taken place about his work, suddenly opens up a whole spectrum of knowledge about what this man had seen in his lifetime, what he has written about, right? Imagine you do the same with Faiz. We will give people who do not have access to either Urdu or English a whole new window into a time and a place that they are unfamiliar with. I mean, in my part of when I say in Sri Lanka, nobody knows about Pakistan, right? They only know about Pakistani cricket. That's about it. It might be the same for you people. You might, Sri Lankan cricket no longer exists, but that's a different matter. But the point is, we hardly know about our societies. So, and it's far more creative to let people access these things in terms of something creative, something like poetry and fiction, rather than academic writing. Right, and this is my interest, and that is why I've translated these two works of fiction, because it's absolutely engaging for me now. Inoue's Japanese play, Jizo Face, which came out in the 1990s, is about the bombing of Hiroshima, and the whole problem, the burden of guilt of surviving the attack when everything else was destroyed. So to me, that was a good enough point of departure to look at the same thing in Sri Lanka about the guilt of survival in the civil war. And I think it worked quite well. The other one, Vita Brevis, which is by Jostein Gaarder, this Norwegian author, the same guy who wrote Sophie's World, is a very interesting kind of critique of the Catholic Church, and it's one of its founders, one of its leaders, Saint Augustine, because his own confessions, the 10 or 12 volumes of confessions, says that he had a wife of some sort that he did not marry, but lived for a very long time with her. He refers to this person, but not by name. Then, of course, he abandoned her to become the bishop of Hippo, and so on and so forth. So the whole book is about this woman hears about this man who's now become a pillar of the Catholic Church, and she writes a letter to him saying, I know what you're all about, this is what we did, and it's a very serious critique of certain positions in the church at the time, and also it has very serious gender implications too. So I thought by translating this, not only will I be able to introduce younger people or anybody to the fiction of this particular author, Jostein Gaarder, but also to a very interesting critique of the Catholic Church, which doesn't exist in the Sinhalese language, right? So I will end here. What I can do is, if you have any questions about either this translating business, to which I didn't go into detail, or the earlier discussion on how to bring some life into social sciences, we can have that chat.